you so much for coming to our best practices for math differentiation webinar, grades 6 through 12. This afternoon, first and foremost, we want to thank the New Hampshire Department of Education for sponsoring these webinar series, specifically for any of the data coaching webinars that we have. They're enabling us to bring all of this information to you for free. So we appreciate our work with them. Just so you know, everybody is muted this afternoon. We can't hear you. Please ask questions if you have any questions as we go throughout. There are a couple of us on the webinar today. And so if you put those questions in the Q&A, we'll be able to field the questions for each other as we go through. Raising your hand is a little bit tricky in a webinar, so the questions being asked in the Q&A is the best way to go. Tomorrow afternoon, 24 hours pretty much from the end of this webinar, you will get an email. It will have a link to the PD certificate. It will tell you where to find the webinar video and any of the PowerPoint or Google Slides that we have within this particular presentation will be there as well. At the end, or as you log off of this webinar, there is a brief survey. We would love your feedback. We're always looking to improve. So if you could take a few moments, I think it's 3 or 4 questions, and it shouldn't take too long. We appreciate it. So for today, I'm Heather Jenkins. I will be one of the folks that's doing the presenting. I also have Marissa Hooper, my colleague here. She'll be presenting as well.
Hi, everyone.
And then Kristen Crawford may be joining us as well. She's our Department of Education contact. So her information will be here as well, and we'll get any answered questions that we can if possible. Again, if you could put them in the Q&A, that will be helpful. All right, I'm going to turn my screen off now. It just makes it a little bit easier for you to see your whole screen and for me to focus. So our essential understandings for today, we want to help you gain a better understanding of how to use data to help meet the needs of all students. And then we really want to make sure that it is manageable, right? As we're doing this, we don't want to have to be creating tons of extra lessons and everything. So we're trying to make it manageable here. We also want to enhance your comprehension of structuring tasks within your classroom that is inherently meeting the needs of diverse learners and really looking at mostly our Tier 1 instruction. So first and foremost, let's just make sure that we all have the same understanding of what we're talking about when we say differentiation. There are a lot of words out there that are sort of forming our thoughts on this particular topic. But there's a lot of nuances in all of these particular areas, whether we're talking about rigor, RTI, or UDL, or higher order thinking skills, and just the word differentiation. I just wanted to be clear about it today so you could know where we were coming from for this. So the big topic is differentiated instruction. So we're trying to really meet the needs and recognizing different learning styles and abilities of our students and their interests. In addition, there's also what we call personalized learning. And so this is really looking at customizing a learning experience for specific students and having a student-driven learning path. We also have the Universal Design for Learning, which is really that framework that helps us put all of this information together and really starts us thinking about the things that might be in our toolbox to be able to help all students. In addition, we have what's called responsive teaching. That basically says, okay, we're looking at the needs of our current students right now, their interests and their progression, and we are changing things accordingly. And then the equitable instruction means that we're just making sure that everybody has access to high quality education and opportunities for success. We're sort of melding all of these together, but for the most part, we're looking almost at these three areas and focusing a little bit more on these areas while kind of bringing in practices from all of them. So for us, what is differentiation? We're going to talk about this a lot, is providing those students with opportunities. And for here, reaching those high standards, meaning that we want to make sure our standards stay high. We don't necessarily look at our class and say, well, everybody's coming in low, so I'm going to teach all of the, previous expectations or all the prerequisite skills instead of what the skills are for my particular grade level or for my class. We can't do that. We can't lower those standards. So really what we want to make sure that we're doing is keeping those standards high and making sure that everybody is reaching their full potential. And today we're talking about math. So we want them to be independent and proficient learners. So we're planning for teaching and responding to the students in front of you each day. So some of the things that we have found when we're out in the field and just talking in general in the education realm, differentiation has kind of gotten a little bit of a reputation for something being really overwhelming, super taxing, and making us create all of these different lessons for everybody. That misconception's hard, right? We're not necessarily having to generate all sorts of different resources for everybody. So that's what we're here to kind of teach you about today. Also, when we talk about differentiation, we want to think about really what we're talking about with tier 1 instruction. We're not just talking about tier 2 and tier 3. We're not talking about just RTI or just intervention. We're talking about tier 1. And when we differentiate for tier 1, that is going to help us really sort of mitigate all of those students who are now falling into tier 2 and tier 3. So what does this require from us, right? Is making sure that we are super knowledgeable, I guess, about the requirements of the students in our class, right? Again, we're not dropping those standards down. We are saying these are the standards and this is what we're being really clear about. We want to make sure we're also addressing the students' needs, and we're planning throughout our lessons to make sure that we're taking into consideration all of the students within our class, and then we're constructing our lessons for the diverse needs of all students. So when we're talking about things that are not differentiated, we're talking about us standing up at the board, talking at students and asking them to complete something. That's not differentiation, right? We're not asking kids to just repeat all the information over and over and over in the same way until the assessment's given. We're not moving on super quickly just because we addressed a topic and I'm so sorry they didn't get it. And then the differentiation also isn't once in a blue moon. I know a lot of people, when they think about differentiation, they think about specifically having like a day where they might have choice in what students are doing, or some sort of different activities that students might be doing that are at different levels. That's differentiation, but it shouldn't be once in a blue moon. And then differentiation, the way that we're looking at it, is not complete individualized instruction for every single student in your classroom. It is thinking about the students in your classroom, taking what we have learned in the past about what students might need and how different students learn, and incorporating those automatically into our classroom. So when we talk about differentiation, we talk about always getting to know our students, making sure we have interactions, observations, and conversations with our students. We can't, again, just stand at the board and teach to them and expect them to really be dialed in. We want to have all of our educators creating a culture and expectation that all students can learn, and that sometimes they need to take a little bit different path. We want to make sure that we are planning with a clear understanding of what our curriculum is and what our students are and how we're going to get them there. And then really looking at the proof of progress, so that consistent sort of progress monitoring and making informed instructional choices in response. The big catalyst for change when it comes to mathematics, and looking at the way that we're teaching math and how we can differentiate and make sure we're meeting the needs of all of our students, as we know full well that there are a lot of things happening within mathematics that's prohibiting students from really getting to know what they need to know. So there's a lot of negative views about math. A lot of kids saying, I'm not a math person. A lot of us teachers saying, it's okay, you don't have to be a math person. But we really want to make sure that we are sending that message of, no, we are all learners and we all learn in our own way. So one of the big catalysts for change for that is to try to get that sort of math thinking and student sort of, I guess, looking at themselves more as mathematicians. We know that the way that students learn mathematics in the early grades is going to be a predictor of how they learn in the later grades, but that does not mean that in the later grades that we can't make a huge change for students as well. Math has really been focused on for a number of years, or was an overemphasis on memorization and not necessarily understanding procedural skills or knowing why, or conceptually understanding why something is the way that it is. They're taught rules, they're taught the skill and drills, so we want to make sure that we're really putting in those deep conceptual understandings with those as well. And then we really want to make sure that they can collaborate. As math teachers, I've done it myself. You look out at your students in your room, you think they're not understanding, you kind of have a little bit of a deer in the headlights, and so we talk more. And that's not necessarily helping students learn. That collaboration and giving them time to do really challenging tasks is going to be able to help. So these are some of the ways that we want to really sort of guide our instruction going forward. So here's some essentials. We obviously need to know our students well. We need to know our content well. We need to be creative and flexible in our thinking. We have to have the belief that all students can learn. That's a do not pass go. We have to believe that all students can learn, and we need to have a clear sense of what we want them to be able to do. So we want to know, what are those standards that we're having students really be able to master? What are those targets that we need for students? Even if we have a program, what is the overall arching goal of what a particular unit or a particular class is, so that we can make sure we know what students need to do along the way? We want to have that safe environment for students that's monitoring vulnerability. We want to have responsible choice making and respecting differences in the way that students might learn or the way they might explain their thinking. And again, this is that really looking at the basis of universal design for learning, and that framework is, what do we have in our sort of understanding of the way students learn math? What things do we continuously add to that to be able to make sure that as we present math experiences in our classroom, that we have that flexibility to be able to incorporate what we have learned in the past about student understanding and how we might explain it differently. And then really what we're going to be talking about in one of the sections here is that, looking at how we can, bring this into our classroom is, let's figure out how we can create tasks and having ongoing assessment to be able to know where our students are at all times. This one here, the having a clear sense of what we want what we think they should know and be able to do, is what we're going to kind of focus on here. So as we're thinking about any units or any time we're teaching, is, what are our goals? What are the learning outcomes? What do we want students to know? What do we want them to understand? And what do we want them to be able to do? These are just examples of what you might have for a specific unit or it's lesson planning here. So we sometimes are stuck on the no, right? We give them information and we want them to spit the information back, but we really want to make sure that we're moving on to that understand and be able to do as well. So how do we differentiate? How do we respond? We want to be flexible in our methods and materials. We want to offer a variety of examples. Eliciting prior knowledge is going to help us. We want to provide think time for students, and we want to explain a concept in more than one way. That in and of itself is differentiation. We're not creating any new lessons or, 16 pathways for students in our classroom, but these are things that we can do right away that will help differentiate your lessons. So the just things to keep in mind, right? We need good quality universal instruction. We're not going to differentiate just to differentiate. We're going to be intentional in how we're planning. We want to know why we're differentiation and what the purpose is. And we want, again, those student outcomes are key, and we want to adjust based on what we're seeing students do now and what their outcomes are. Right? This next part, I want to talk a little bit about data as well. So I'm going to pass this off and using data to differentiate.
So like Heather was talking about, we really want to be able to use data in those learning outcomes in order to respond to the students in front of us. So we just want to remember some of the key essentials. We really need to know our students, their abilities, their interests, their learning styles, and if they're students who are on IEPs or have a 504, what accommodations or modifications they might require. And then know that some students have needs beyond differentiation, what those are so we can address them. We also need to know our content. So really unpacking those standards, what students need to know, be able to do, and understand. And that requires having learning objectives or success criteria and ensuring that students know what that success criteria is, what they need to do to be successful. And just throwing it out there, just to the middle, our tier 2 is growing larger. It's getting bigger. And so we are teaching more to the middle and it's not working. So we have each end of the spectrum and we need to make sure that, like Heather said, we are keeping those high expectations and those high standards for our students for them to be able to meet them. And we want to use ongoing assessments, and that's what we're going to talk about here. We've broken them down into what we mean when we're talking about formal or informal assessments and how we're going to use them in order to collect data. And that data is going to help us differentiate in our classroom. So we wanted to really make it clear that data is going to drive our responsive teaching in our classroom. So this collection of data that we're talking about is going to help us respond to the students in front of us. And we differentiate through responsive teaching. So when we talk about differentiation or we talk about responsive teaching, they're kind of one and the same. So if we look at our tier 1 instruction and we think about differentiating, we're kind of doing this, loop constantly where we're assessing our students informally. When we hear the word assessment, sometimes we think these large assessments. We're talking about informal assessments, and we're going to go into them deeper in a minute. And we're collecting that data, and then we're responding and differentiating based on what that data tells us. And then we're consistently doing this throughout our instruction. So when we're collecting this data, we have our formal data. So that can be the SAT, the New Hampshire SAS, it can be any progress monitoring data, universal screeners. And although it does help us with our instruction, a lot of times we use that for an RTI time, a win time. We group kids with it. we're talking about informal data in our tier 1 instruction. This is going to help us differentiate and respond in our classrooms with the students in front of us. So we're just going to talk about a little bit about what this informal data collection is. So we're talking about our exit tickets in our classroom and classwork that students are doing. Our observations of students, the work that they're doing, the conversations that they're having with each other. We think about the discussions, the whole group discussions with a partner or a group or a conference with a student. And also through note taking, we can tell a lot about how students are doing within, if you have note taking in your classroom, however you set that up. And then body language is a big one. And, this informal data, a lot of this we're collecting in our heads. For instance, those observations and discussions, the note taking, the body language. We don't have a formal way to write that data down that we're collecting. But the data you collect in your head is very valid. And when you collect it, you're able to respond based on what you're seeing. So we're just going to break down a little bit just to give you a few examples. If the space bar won't work. This one I know is going to be exit tickets and classwork. And when we think about collecting data,
So sorry. I'm going to keep it here for just a second.
Okay. So when we collect data through exit tickets and classwork, really what we're doing in order to collect that data is we're observing the work that students are doing, how they're solving a problem, how they're answering questions, what tools they're using. We're observing what they're doing, listening to student answers during work time. Like I said, whether that's with each other or a whole class, listening to what they're doing. And then gathering exit ticket evidence into an Excel sheet. So if you look at, if you have common formative assessments or anything like that, you can gather that data and then respond, not immediately, but, next day. Thank you for bearing with us.
So sorry.
And then how can we differentiate and respond? Well, we can give choice in the kinds of questions that we're asking our students. We can tier our lessons. We can create parallel tasks, which still allows students to have a choice, but allows kids access to kind of their starting point. It gives them an entry point. We can create more open tasks. So not having a correct answer for students, those types of problems. I know in math that can be difficult, but there definitely are ways that you can create those types of problems to help students. And then if you're given a set of problems, how we can open them and modify them. All of these ways to differentiate and respond, we're going to go through later in more detail and actually give examples of what giving choice, parallel tasks, open tasks, what those questions can look like. So for discussions and must have just been that slide. For discussions and observations, we know we can collect data. We're going to listen to their responses to each other. We're going to have students also write down their explanations, how they're doing their work or coming to a conclusion, and listening to their explanation of concepts. So that will that data that we're collecting while we're listening and observing how they're doing things, we can respond to them if they're doing really well or they're maybe not explaining a concept correctly. We can start by asking the right questions, and we do have a list later of exactly what those questions are, but to get students to start thinking about what they're doing, giving them time to work with each other, collaboration. We know as teachers that collaborating with each other is super helpful, and we learn so much from each other in making sure that students have that time as well. Ensuring that they're explaining their thinking. How did you get that answer? What tools did you use? Whatever it might be, but having them explain what they're doing and why. and also giving them ample share time. So when we think of note taking, we want to make sure students understand their notes. I'm sure everyone has read the book, Building Thinking Classrooms. There's a section of note taking in there. We definitely recommend reading about it. Because if we are seeing that they're not understanding notes, if they're even using them. So if they're not using them, they definitely don't understand them and they're not helpful. And seeing if they're able to explain in their own words why and what they're doing. I know that starting from the younger grades, notes can be guided and they're eventually taught to take their own notes, but kind of allowing them a scaffold and giving them enough, but not so much that you're pretty much telling them what to write down. So allowing them to create their own notes of what their future selves are going to need can be very helpful. And lastly is body language. So even the way students are coming into our classroom, they're yawning, they're slumped over, observing their body language, and then listening to, choices they're making, where they're sitting, can tell us a lot maybe about how our class is going to go. And differentiating based on their needs can be a world of difference. So we can adjust our lessons, obviously not the whole thing, but a little bit to make sure that our students' interests are being met, to get them engaged. And then adapting the lesson according to their level of motivation. We know if they're slumped over, they're tired, get up and move around and make the lesson interactive. Making sure students are actively relocating, and being curious about disengagement. This is a huge one. A lot of times we can make assumptions about why students are not engaged. Maybe we think they're tired, they don't like math, whatever it may be. But sometimes, and a lot of times actually, it's much more than that. A lot of times they're not understanding, and we need to make sure that we're responding to that and we're not assuming the reasons why. And then just a little disclaimer, which I know Heather mentioned earlier. When our students are giving us that deer in the headlights look, we like to continue talking, thinking that if we give more examples, we explain in another way, or try to explain further what we were saying, that it's going to help. And it really doesn't. So we want to switch it up. We don't want to overwhelm our kids, and differentiating and responding in that moment will definitely help with that.
Okay, so next we are looking at the transferring to the classroom. So let's take a look here. So as we're thinking about the transfer to the classroom, we're looking at the different phases of student learning, from novice to capable to proficient, and not just providing different activities for the different groups of students. We want to make sure that we are providing all of these particular students with appropriate information. So this is a lot of information on one page. So really, when we're talking about transferring to the classroom, first and foremost, we want it to be manageable. We have a lot of different students in our classroom and a lot of different needs, and we want to try to do what we can about having a particular task or a particular activity be accessible for all students. So the challenge is to figure out how to do that portion of it, but it's not creating all different activities. And it's making sure that the students are continuously being engaged and that they're learning through conversation and that they understand that they are a valuable part of the classroom community. So we're talking tier 1 instruction. As Marissa had mentioned earlier, we've been, one of the things, the teaching to the middle is not working, right? We know this. We've been teaching to the average student. Now our average is going down. We still have kids. We feel like they're coming in, with a wider span every single year, but I don't necessarily think the span is widening. I think just more students are getting to the bottom of that span. And so our tier one is a lower, sort of group of students in some cases. They just don't have those particular skills. But we need to make sure that we're keeping all of that in mind of what every student would need at all levels as we're teaching, not just what an average student would need. So we're looking at high quality instructional materials. We're looking at instructional supports and different types of interventions. And we're looking at a lot of formative assessments to figure out what students' strengths and weaknesses are. And that's sort of that constant ongoing practice. So when we're talking about planning for all, we're talking all, right? It is your EL learners, your struggling learners, your students with disabilities, students who need enrichment. As teachers, we know, or we should know, that just because a student is special ed doesn't mean that's their student. It is your student. They're in your classroom, and you're to make sure that you are also meeting the needs of that student in your classroom. So we're looking at what supports are going to be needed to, basically modeling and thinking aloud and specific instruction. And then when we're doing and we're thinking about this, we're talking about maybe looking at the structure of our environment. What are potential barriers there might be? We want to make sure that we're really providing clarity for students, thinking about alternate ways to assess, and thinking about practice and summary, and not just skill and drill, and you have 100 of these questions to do. As we break down differentiation, we wanted to show sort of, this is what teachers do and this is what students will do. So teachers, you're going to be moving around the classroom, even if you're a high school, especially if you're a high school teacher, the junior high or middle school as well. We want to keep moving around the classroom and not just teaching to a board. We want to make sure that we're gathering and utilizing the information that we're finding as we're going back. We're offering verbal feedback. We're going to scaffold instruction and questions. We want to use different depth of knowledge. We don't want to stick at a depth of knowledge one that's just let's regurgitate the information. That's a very simple problem. We want to make sure that we're really diving into some of those a little bit more challenging problems as well. And we're really looking for evidence of student understanding. What students are doing is, especially in the middle school and high school, they should be able to understand what their goals are and to take ownership of their learning. To do that, though, they need to understand explicitly what they need to learn and what that particular learning means for them. So we need to be able to help them understand the direction that we're going on. We can't just assume they're going to be on the road and along for the ride and they're going to get it. We need to make it really clear what they're learning. We want them to be able to ask for help. We want them to utilize their resources. So often in our classrooms, we provide different resources or different ways in which students can make their learning a little bit easier, and students don't use them. So we want to make it clear that that's the expectation, is they're going to use those resources. This work in collaborating with peers, I know it's more and more challenging for the upper grade levels to have collaboration. I've been in many classrooms where teachers have said, talk with the kids in your group, and they're sitting in pods and nobody says a thing. We can't have that happening. It has to be a mandate. You are talking, this is the way, and it's direct instruction of how to do that. And then we want to make sure that, again, that's that pre-modeled structures and routines. Just because kids are in middle school or high school doesn't mean they know how to collaborate. Just because they're in middle school or high school doesn't mean that they know how to do these particular things that we think should be something that's easy for them. So we just want to make sure we're modeling at all times. Thinking about student characteristics, interest. obviously we want to keep students' interests in mind. If we're creating math problems or math situations, we want them to be able to be intriguing for them, or to have them want to learn about it. If whenever we can. It's obviously not always possible, but if it's on specific topics, you can at least have current event topics in there. We want to make sure we're thinking about student readiness. Are they ready for this? What are the different levels that we have, or choices, or difficulty of things? And then what is the student's learning profile? And are we able to make sure that we are looking at their learning profiles and not just teaching the way we've always felt like we could understand it? We need to make sure that we're teaching in ways that we know that students are learning now. It's harder and harder to do that now. So we want to just make sure that we're really kind of keeping up with the best ways in which students are learning. Different ways to increase interest, just a list here. Variety is always good. Broad access to materials is essential, right? If we've got, just because you're in middle school or high school doesn't mean that you're not using manipulatives in some way or different materials, and students should always have access to that. Giving students choice, it's funny, choice is definitely a hot topic over the last few years, and saying students have to have choice and everything. That doesn't mean that they need 100 different choices. It's that maybe they have a choice of the way that they're solving a problem. It doesn't have to be a choice in exactly what they're doing. And so these other ones here, looking at something, it's funny, a lot of times in classrooms, we want to challenge students, and we work really hard, and we say, okay, this is going to be something I want to really challenge them. And then you get into it and you realize, okay, that is not achievable by this particular group of students. We want to make sure that it's achievable. And we want to have students come into the classroom and think, what are we going to be doing today? And not necessarily just be flipping to the next page in a workbook, or the next page in, of, like any sort of textbook or things like that. Looking at readiness, we need to adjust the degree of difficulty for some students. Sometimes we need to modify problems so that we can have access for everybody. Everybody keeps talking about scaffolding, and we definitely want to scaffold, but the whole point of a scaffold is to remove them at some point. So we want to try our best to figure out how to do that and have students be really independent in that way as well. And then again, this varying presentation of content. I know it's hard, but we're working on Google. A lot of times it's Google Slides, or it's looking at slide decks and what have you, and we want to be able to vary how we're presenting as much as possible, so that it doesn't just become this sort of routine and then kids are just not interested anymore. So we can look here at the next thing is the learning profiles. So we want to have flexible spaces and learning options. I know a lot of times people put students in pods for collaboration, but sometimes you also need to have those single desks where kids that just really have a hard time working that way, and have some sort of other option for them. So making space from multiple modalities, all this means is basically we want to have our presentation methods be different, different as much as possible, and to have students show their work in different ways as well. So they might show it on a computer, they might show it on a page, they might show it somewhere else. That choice, again, how they're solving things, or a way in which they can show you what they know. Varied materials for everybody, and then providing authentic learning opportunities. These are just some general questions that you might be able to use in your classrooms to be able to elicit thinking and to have that collaborative environment in your classroom. So these are just some general ideas. You can take a peek at them in the slide deck as you get it tomorrow. And then, so when we're talking about math, we're talking about learning about different ways of thinking, habits of thinking, and the ways that we're doing things. So we want to make sure that we're building that shared understanding of those mathematical ideas, and comparing different approaches to solving problems. We want to make sure that students are able to solve problems in different ways, and that is celebrated as much as possible as well. As we're teaching math, we cannot forget about, we have all of our standards and everything, but the 8 standards of mathematical practice are essential to ensure that all students are really able to think critically and to be able to become a little bit more mathematical in their thinking. So we want to make sure that in our classrooms that we are incorporating these into our everyday activities, and showing students, especially at the higher grade levels, it's hard to give students an understanding or a purpose of exactly why they're learning it. And the last thing they want to hear, or that you would want to say, is, well, this is a required class, so this is why you're learning it, right? But the math practice standards are something that you can always loop into. We're learning this because we're becoming good problem solvers. We're able to construct arguments. We're able to critique our understanding and to be able to learn from others. So there's a lot of these math practice standards, specifically in the upper grades, that are going to be really essential for students to be understanding as they're moving through their math years. So for problem solving, this is a big one. We want to make sure that students have problem solving abilities, especially in the upper grades. This is the end game, right? We want them to be able to solve problems, and we want them to not just apply what they are understanding, but we want them to actually learn it and to be able to say, I've learned this and now I can actually apply this in another way. And we want them to have that flexibility and understanding, and be able to kind of break things apart, and not just have, okay, I've learned these skills and now I'm doing this because this is what I'm told to do. It's really understanding and thinking critically. Chunking and scaffolding is the biggest sort of beginning parts of differentiation, chunking things into a little bit more manageable skills, scaffolding as much as students might need, and then taking away those scaffolds as students are able to understand the material. Pre-teaching is a huge one. Just the scaffolding that I feel like is really helpful, specifically now with students who might be coming in that are not quite at the level that we are hoping they're coming into our classrooms, is showing them a skill from something that they might have learned prior, and then showing them how that is directly correlating to what they're learning in their this particular classroom. So making those connections for them and having them understand them is key. So different types of tasks that you might be able to do to be able to differentiate the information within your classroom is, first one's giving choices. So I know this is tiny. I have the link here, so it will, G Fletchy is something that's a really great website. This is when we're giving choices of students, this is one way that would be really easy. So we've got what they're doing here specifically on the side, and then there's a question where the result is unknown, or the change is unknown, or the start is unknown. So just mixing it up and allowing students to figure out which one they want to actually be able to solve and be able to explain is helpful. They're still getting the concept, but they are able to choose which particular example that they want to be able to solve, which question. choice boards. These are have been big for a number of years, not necessarily as much, I feel like, in the upper grades, but this is an example of one of an upper grade task card or center that you might be able to do where students are choosing which particular tasks they want to do. Another way to differentiate is with tiered lessons. So we're looking at, this is basically scaffolding in motion, I guess. So the focus of the tasks are the same, but they have different levels of complexity. So some are a little bit easier. An example might be that in one particular question, you might be using something with decimals, and another one you have your whole numbers or what have you. It's really looking at where your students are, how many steps they might need to be able to understand, or how many concepts, and then tiering those particular lessons and concepts so that they are able to understand each step along the way. Whenever we're doing tiered lessons, you want to keep your prerequisite and impeding skills in mind. This is the New Hampshire Department of Ed has progressions on their website. So this is just a progression of skills here, so you can see where students might be coming from and where they need to be going to. So that might be helpful in creating tiered lessons. Parallel tasks is another way to differentiate. So the way to look at parallel tasks is, again, you can be looking at the size of numbers, which operations you're using. And then what happens is you are able to create parallel tasks depending on what your student's understanding is. And the next one, I'm going to kind of go through on what a parallel task might look like. So here's an example of a middle school parallel task and a high school parallel task. And you can see that they're getting to some of the same standards and the same skills, but we're looking at two different ways to be able to show that thinking or that understanding. For open problems, this is one of the big sort of topics that I've been hearing a lot in math. It was something that NCTM had quite a number of sessions on for their yearly conference this year as well. And so open problems, what this is it encourages students to really think more broadly about concepts. Most open problems, there's no repetition. It can focus on where common misunderstandings are, and it really allows an entry or access point for all learners. Because open problems do not have a single answer, they can be used in basically any math classroom for students to be able to show what they know and what level they are with that understanding. A little bit more about open problems is students can work independently or in groups, and they share their solutions. Again, it's multiple solutions or approaches to be able to solve a problem. And because it's open-ended, the students aren't just focused on what is the answer. There are so many times where I'm in a math classroom and they are task-oriented. They just want to finish it and say, here is the answer. And it throws students for a loop when you say, I actually don't want to know the answer today. That's the last thing I want to know. What I want to know is what you did to solve the problem. And that is taking, a whole different level of understanding for students. So here's a couple of open problems for you for middle school and for high school. It's basically any problem that you can create that has multiple answers. And then there's a lot of different websites out there. There's a website called Open Middle, and that's something that is super helpful right now as well, in being able to figure out, okay, how do I take a problem? This is what I want the problem to be about. And here are some examples for what we have for open problems. So this right here is what we can look at. So this is how to change a closed problem basically into an open problem. So this is closed problems, right? They can really be something that students are just trying to figure out a specific example. So we want to begin by looking at prior knowledge, right? So you can rewrite the equation in slope-intercept form. So that's how we could be looking at prior knowledge. And then you can ask a question that's an extension, right? So here is the actual problem, and here are some questions that you might be able to ask to open it up. Just some cautions, right? We want to make sure they're really meaningful and mathematically meaningful. So we don't want to just open up a problem just to say we have an open problem. We want to make sure that they're not too vague and that they're explicitly asking students to do a specific skill. And then you want to make sure that you're looking at the level of understanding that your students have to make sure that everybody can access that particular problem. So there's different methods also to modify problems. So not just opening up problems, but you might be able to do a generalization, or you might be able to reverse the focus in a problem. So if this is your given problem where you're simplifying an expression, this is a generalized version of what you might be able to, instead of simplify the expression, you might be able to ask something like this, or you could reverse the focus and say, all right, this is what the results are. Let's change that around and figure out how you could figure out what those the values for A and B might be. So flexibility questions. So we're looking at asking students, how are these problems alike or how are they different? So example 1 here, how are they alike or how are they different? And then the example 2 here for how these things might be alike. Just eliciting any sort of conversation with students and having them find what might be the same or what might be different with each one is helpful in getting them to deepen their understanding of mathematics. Another way to modify problems, so we're looking at equivalency or points of confusion. So are these two things equivalent?
I found this on.
How can you be sure, or how are you not? And then points of confusion. So this is something that you can see the steps here. Can you explain where the error was in this? Or if there is an error or not, and explain what they might be thinking that had them produce the error. So when designing worthwhile tasks, we want to make sure that we are activating that prior knowledge, making sure that students understand the problem and that there are clear expectations. So that's before it. During the task, you need to be able to let go. You need to let students do their thing. You need to provide support if needed or extensions if needed, but a lot of times students are really trying to work through their understanding. And so we want to just, I guess for all intents and purposes, zip it and let them work through it. And then after, you want to have students share their understanding. We're creating that community of learners. We want to actively listen without evaluation, which is really hard because we want to say, well, and we want to correct them, but we want them to be able to explain their thinking all the way through and then help them figure out how they might be able to explain it in a way that would maybe be a little bit more understandable, but we need to let them go with that. And we need to make sure that we're summarizing the main ideas of why we are learning this and what we need to do to understand this and where we're going in the future with it. So a lot of times the way to look at differentiating is to look at the kinds of questions you're asking. Are you asking something that is an answer only question, or are you looking at directing them towards understanding a specific skill? Are you asking cognitively demanding questions? Are you making sure that students have to explain things or justify things? And how can you guarantee that what you're asking is promoting and prompting deeper level thinking for every student? So assessing versus advancing questions. So a lot of times we don't realize that we're asking strictly questions that are assessing a student's just general understanding or general skill knowledge. We want to try to start asking more advancing questions and encouraging students to really progress their thinking and gets them involved in their own learning. And so these are just a couple of examples of what it might be to ask an assessing question or an advancing question. All right, so if we're looking at what is the distance formula, or what is the solution, and then how are the table and the graph of this function the same or different? So you can see that there's a little bit of a difference in what you're asking students to do and to be able to understand. Some examples of advancing questions here. Again, just, we wanted to give you a little bit of understanding about what it is to ask advancing questions and getting students to really develop their mathematical understanding in a deeper way. Here's some other resources. This is that open middle that I was talking about here. Before we go, I know we have just another minute or so. Lynette Lawrence is the head of the NHED UDL network. They're working with CAST, and they've been doing that since 2015. And they're starting work that will be independent of CAST going forward, but they are, if you want anything, any other knowledge about universal design for learning or what that framework is and how we can think about what the students' understanding is and the science behind sort of the brain and how students learn, these are your people. So we just wanted to make sure that you had the information for Lynette. I think she was hoping to be on this particular webinar today. It might be in the future as well. So definitely contact them if you're looking for any information about universal design for learning. And then just in closing, right, getting to know our students. That's the biggest thing that we can do, and make sure that they are building their own math identities and that they are positive identities, not the I can't. You're getting kids in junior high, like the middle, from 6th to 12th grade. You're getting a lot of, it's sort of what I would say is math trauma from students, and they have not necessarily had good experiences with math, and it can be hard to overcome, but it's something that I think we're going to hear a lot more about in the future, and getting students to really understand that we're all math learners. If you have any questions, here's our contact information, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much.